Asfaltovenator was a moderately large theropod, around 7 meters in length or just about 20 feet. So certainly not as massive as things that would show up later like Allosaurus or Tyrannosaurus rex, but it also very importantly lived long before those animals during the Middle Jurassic. The Middle Jurassic is really important for understanding theropod diversification, because during the Triassic before the Jurassic, there was the first real rise of dinosaurs. The very first dinosaurs evolved during that period. And by the early Jurassic, they had diversified some. For example, there was Dilophosaurus and Sinosaurus, two largish theropods that were about the same size as Asfaltovenator that came from the early Jurassic. As well as you have some things like Saltriovenator, which was similarly sized and was a ceratosaur, which would lead to some of the other groups later down the line in the late Jurassic and into the Cretaceous. But then there's this massive gap in the Middle Jurassic. We just don't have the right age of rocks at the surface. And that means we go from this very limited amount of diversity, Dilophosaurines like Dilophosaurus and Sinosaurus, but then also just a handful of ceratosaurs like Saltriovenator, to suddenly having many different representatives of many different theropod groups. Basically, all of them had diversified by the late Jurassic. You have oviraptorines and early tyrannosaur relatives, and the allosaurs and megalosaurs. There's just this massive burst of diversity that probably happened in the Middle Jurassic that we just don't know about. And that's why we're looking at Asfaltovenator, because it fits very uniquely into that picture. Asfaltovenator comes from the Cañadón Asfalto Formation, which is in Argentina and is far different than that environment is today. It's specifically in the Patagonia region, which today is known for being pretty arid and sometimes more like a grassland. But 170 million years ago, this region was dominated by large forests, lakes, and rivers, as well as a rift system. When we think about rift systems, what you need to understand is that it's where continents break apart. So you can actually see where this happened, where parts of North America, South America, and Africa all kind of meet together like a puzzle. That's the triple junction where that rift really started to form. You can actually see one of these even still today in East Africa. Together with the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, the Great Rift Valley represents one of these places where continents are trying to break apart. Now Africa is still not going to break apart for another few million years if that break is successful. So we don't really need to worry about it that much, but we can at least understand how that environment might have played into how Asfaltovenator would have lived and what kind of environment it would have been in. Rifts form by thinning the crust, and that means it needs to stretch a whole lot. So you get these big faults on either side of a large valley, in this case the Great Rift Valley, and then also historically where the Cañadón Asfalto Formation was deposited. These low areas become really good for a lot of lakes and streams to run through, and that also means there's a lot of water collected, and it would have been relatively warm during the Middle Jurassic. As much as this was part of South America and somewhat southern on South America, the overall environment during the Middle Jurassic was still warmer. When I talked about the earlier breakup of Africa, South America, and North America, that released a lot of volcanic gases into the atmosphere, which warmed the climate. So despite being further south than the modern Great Rift Valley, it would have been a pretty similar environment with a few notable differences. One of these main differences between where Asfaltovenator would have lived and the modern Great African Rift Valley can be found in Amboseli National Park in Kenya, which is a big grassland. And the reason we know that it wasn't like this for Asfaltovenator is because Asfaltovenator lived before grasses even existed, which is kind of an odd concept to think about, that it lived before grasses really evolved. But while the plants were different, there would have still been a lot of similarities between the Cañadón Asfalto Formation and the modern-day African Rift Valley. And one of the most important parts of that is the volcanism that would have still been occurring there. And that's because as you get these large faults on each side of these valleys that produces these mountains, you oftentimes get basalts that can actually flow up that. And a basalt is a kind of lava, so this magma would have flown up those cracks created by those faults and then erupted at the surface in large plains, essentially. Rather than being a single large eruption like Mount St. Helens, you get basalt floods, where there's just a lot of this very liquidy lava just pouring out of the ground constantly. You would also get this kind of thing occasionally from large mountains and large volcanoes, kind of like you have Kilimanjaro in East Africa today. Same concept, where the crust is thinner, sometimes lava can actually get up to the surface. And to make one more comparison between the Great African Rift Valley and Asfaltovenator, the Great African Rift Valley has the dominant predator being the lion, and Asfaltovenator would have been the lion of its time. Not in that it hunted in a pride, we don't have direct evidence of that, but in that it was very clearly the largest animal in the environment that was hunting. At least as far as we know, there's nothing else that gets close, and we have found other theropods from this formation, including things like Pietnietskisaurus, as well as Eoabailosaurs, both of which only got to about half as long as Asfaltovenator. They would have been on the menu for a fully grown Asfaltovenator. But all of that tracks with what we see in the later Jurassic as well. There were a few different really large theropod groups in the late Jurassic, most notably the allosaurs like Allosaurus, but also the megalosaurs like Megalosaurus. Sometimes the names aren't super original. But, like I said, that does track, because it's very likely that Asfaltovenator, for reasons I'll get into, is very closely related to either the megalosaurs or the allosaurs. And so as it became, or its relatives became much larger and evolved into things like Allosaurus or Megalosaurus, it seems like that opened up space for some of those other animals to start getting larger as well. For example, by the late Jurassic, we have Ceratosaurus, which is actually pretty closely related to Eoabailosaurus, which, as I already mentioned, have the length of Asfaltovenator. But in Ceratosaurus, it's 20 feet long. It's as large as Asfaltovenator. Meanwhile, though, the animals that were related to Asfaltovenator got even larger, pushing 30 feet or 10 meters. So again, the size difference is still pretty significant when you're looking at these animals. So despite the fact that even those smaller animals under the feet of Asfaltovenator did get larger, Asfaltovenator and its relatives also got larger. But that still doesn't answer what Asfaltovenator was, and like I mentioned, big burst of diversity during the Middle Jurassic. But all of that diversity in the late Jurassic, again, started in the Middle Jurassic. So that means we can plug in Asfaltovenator to our different metrics to try and understand how it was related to other animals and try and see what it was, especially since it's one of our only good looks at a theropod from the Middle Jurassic. Because this fossil is mostly complete. You have basically the entire skull, parts of the arms, and a lot of the rib cage, and parts of the leg. So it's really useful to be able to actually understand what's actually going on, as opposed to some of the other theropod dinosaurs, also from the Cañadón Asfalto Formation, which are a bit more partial. But this is also where the real world starts getting a little bit in the way of the actual research, because Asfaltovenator was described in December of 2019, and we generally know what happened 3 months later when everything shut down. It's really unfortunate for people who want to do research on this animal to suddenly not be able to go to Argentina and check it out. It does make sense because, global pandemic, but it is unfortunate. This means there's been relatively few papers about what exactly Asfaltovenator is. However, because this was published, some other researchers were able to at least take what the researchers had published at face value and put it into their own matrices, which confirm largely the same result, which is that megalosaurs and allosaurs were super closely related. There's been a little bit of debate about this and how closely related different theropod groups were, with some of the ideas being like, okay, the ceratosaurs branch off, and then the megalosaurs branch off, and then finally the coelurosaurs, the more bird-like theropods, and the allosaurs broke off from one another. Instead, it seems like there was a much more complicated Carnosauria that did break off and then diversify during the Middle Jurassic. And this is largely because Asfaltovenator has a wide number of traits that align itself with both the megalosaurs and the allosaurs. So starting with the megalosaur-like traits, there's a little divot in the top process of the maxillary bone, as well as this depression near the occipital condyle where the neck articulates and meets with the head. It's where the bones move relative to one another. There's also an enlargement on the dentary bone on the lower jaw. There's also a lack of a groove which would attach a muscle from the top of the fibula into the upper leg. But there's also features that make it seem more closely related to things like Allosaurus. For example, there's a hole leading between the nasal passages and the anteorbital fenestra, the large hole that's in front of the eye. There's also a depression near the bottom of the humerus in the arm for muscle attachments, as well as a lot of pneumatic foramen being present around the nose and nasal passages. Foramen are normally used for transporting blood or nerves to different parts of the skull or other parts of the body. But in this specific case, they appear more pneumatic, meaning they were carrying air, meaning maybe there was some sort of inflatable sac, maybe it was just flushing that area with air for some other reason, we don't really know. But it is something that we do find in allosaurs that we don't really find in other theropod groups. So Asfaltovenator was kind of a hodgepodge as far as what exactly the traits that it had were and what that means it might have been. But fortunately, we have statistical tests for that. I'll go into this in more detail in my upcoming taxonomy video, but basically you just score the different characteristics as to whether or not it has it, whether or not it has it a little bit, whether or not it has it a lot. So for example, you could look at the hole that goes from the nasal passages into the anteorbital fenestra and give it a 1 because it does have that instead of a 0 because it doesn't have that. They then would do this for the characteristics I mentioned and many, many more. And like I said, this was done by other researchers too, just using the data that was presented in this paper. And all of them pretty much came to the same conclusion that Asfaltovenator was an early branching allosauroid. But that's not as important as the general consensus about the rest of the group Theropods, because it really does suggest that the megalosaurs and the allosaurs were much, much closer related, and that the spinosaurs actually branched off super early, which is something that'll probably get a little more research as we hopefully find early spinosaur material from somewhere, which I'm at least hopeful will happen, but you never know. For now, we might just have to go with what we found with this Asfaltovenator. And now that things are opening back up, hopefully we'll get some more researchers to actually take a look at this fossil and help us to better understand how theropods actually became what they were, especially many of these large theropods that dominated their environments. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Asfaltovenator is a really, really interesting animal, and I really hope there is more done with it. The whole Middle Jurassic dinosaur diversification is so poorly understood. I would love to see more work done on trying to understand how that all happened. These videos, the what the heck is it? What the hell is it? These are voted on by the patrons. So if you want to participate in voting for these, feel free to check out the Patreon. We also really appreciate the support because there's a lot of effort between editing and filming and researching that goes into these videos. So we really do appreciate the support. With that said, everyone be safe, take care, don't go extinct.